They laughed at the Vietnamese farmer the moment they saw him. They laughed at his thin body, bent by years of work in flooded rice fields. They laughed at his torn clothes, stained with mud and sweat. But above all, they laughed at the tool in his hands, a simple farming implement, old, worn, something no soldier would ever mistake for a weapon. 63 French colonial soldiers stood on the dirt path leading to the village. They were trained men, armed with modern rifles, boots polished, uniforms intact. They had crossed rivers, forests, and villages like this one dozens of times before. To them, this was not a nation. It was territory. It was property. It was nothing more than conquered land waiting to be exploited. They believed one thing with absolute certainty: no one would die that night. When the sun rose the next morning, none of them returned. This is the story that history books never told. The story that was buried in classified reports, whispered in colonial command corridors, and deliberately erased from official records. Because what happened that night defied all the rules of conventional warfare. It defied the logic of power. It defied the very narrative that empires build about themselves. And above all, it revealed a truth that no empire wants to admit: that ordinary men, when pushed beyond all limits, when defending the land they've known since birth, when they choose not to kneel one more time, these men become something that no military training can prepare you to face. At the height of French colonial expansion in Southeast Asia, Vietnam existed on paper as a possession. Lines were drawn on maps by men who had never walked the land. Reports were written in offices far from the heat, the insects, and the silence of the countryside. To colonial command, villages were numbers. People were obstacles or labor, nothing more. French Indochina, as it was called, stretched across vast territories that included what we know today as Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But control on paper didn't mean control in reality. The coastal cities, with their colonial buildings and European cafes, could pretend to be little pieces of France transplanted to Asia. But the interior was different. The interior was untamable. French patrols moved through rural areas to enforce control. Sometimes they collected taxes from people who barely had enough to eat. Sometimes they searched for rebels in villages that had never seen a fighter. Sometimes they were simply there to remind the population who held the power, who had the guns, who made the rules. Resistance was punished swiftly. Villages that spoke too loudly disappeared. Houses were burned. Men were taken away. Women and children were left behind to tell the story, to spread the fear. Villages that remained silent survived, at least for one more day. And silence was common, especially when armed men arrived laughing. The laughter was its own form of violence. It was a statement. It said, "You don't matter. Your lives carry no weight. We are so superior, we don't even need to pretend respect." It was the sound of men who had forgotten they were walking on land that didn't belong to them, among people who had their own stories, their own memories, their own limits. The farmer had no recorded name. History rarely preserves men like him. There are no statues, no plaques, no national days of remembrance. He was Vietnamese, born in a small village surrounded by rice paddies and bamboo groves. His life had been shaped by routine. Before dawn, he worked the fields. At noon, he rested briefly in the shade. At night, he returned home with aching hands and a tired body. He knew every inch of that land. He knew where water accumulated during the monsoons. He knew which paths became impassable after rain. He knew the sounds of bamboo bending in the wind, the pattern of frogs at night, the exact moment when birds stopped singing. This knowledge didn't come from books or maps. It came from a lifetime of walking barefoot through mud, from nights sleeping to the sound of the forest, from years observing how the land breathed and changed with the seasons. The land was not something he owned. It was something he belonged to. The tool he carried that day was not made for fighting. It was used to dig irrigation channels, to break stubborn roots, to prepare soil for planting. It had fed his family for years. It had built the foundation of their survival. It had never spilled human blood. His hands knew that handle better than they knew anything else. They knew exactly where the wood was worn, where to grip for the best balance, how to swing it to maximize force without wasting energy. Thousands of hours of work had transformed that tool into an extension of his own body. War had never been part of his plans. He was not a soldier, not a revolutionary, not a hero waiting for his moment. He was just a man who wanted to work his land, feed his family, and live in peace. But war doesn't ask for permission. War arrives unexpectedly, brought by men who decide that your land now belongs to someone else, that your life now serves other purposes, that your dignity is now subject to the whims of strangers with guns. When the French patrol entered the village that day, they found no fighters waiting, no barricades, no gunfire, just families retreating into their homes, doors closing quietly, eyes lowered. Children were pulled inside. Voices were silenced. The entire village shrank, trying to become invisible, hoping the soldiers would pass quickly. It was a dance everyone knew. It had been rehearsed many times before. The farmer did not move away. He stood on the path, holding his tool, saying nothing. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't bravery. It was simply that he was too tired to run. He had worked all day. His back ached. His feet were sore. And something inside him, something that had been compressed by years of occupation, years of silent humiliation, years of lowering his eyes and swallowing his anger. Something broke. Not spectacularly, not with shouts or declarations. It just broke, silently, like old wood finally giving way under constant weight. A French officer laughed openly when he saw him. The sound echoed through the village. Other soldiers joined in. It was the kind of laughter that comes easily to men who have never had to fear consequences, who have never had to wonder if their targets might fight back. Another soldier stepped forward and prodded him with a rifle barrel. The cold metal pressed against his ribs. Someone kicked the tool from his hands, sending it skidding across the dirt. More laughter followed. Jokes were exchanged in a language the villagers didn't speak, but the meaning was clear enough. To the soldiers, he was not a man. He was part of the landscape. Something weak, something already defeated, something that could be pushed, kicked, ridiculed without a second thought. Just another peasant in another forgettable village on another routine patrol day. They ordered the villagers to remain inside after nightfall. The patrol would camp nearby. It was routine, a show of presence. By morning they would move on, maybe to the next village, maybe back to the outpost. It didn't matter. Another day serving the empire. Another night in the interior. Nothing special, nothing memorable. Just another day that would be forgotten as soon as it ended. That night, the farmer did not sleep. He sat alone, listening to the sounds of the land he had known since childhood. Insects, water moving slowly through channels, the distant calls of animals, the rustling of bamboo, the familiar pattern of nocturnal life that had been the soundtrack of his entire existence. He thought about the laughter. He thought about the way the tool had been kicked aside. He thought about all the other days like that one, scattered across years. All the other times he had lowered his eyes. All the other times he had stepped back. All the other times he had swallowed his anger and told himself that surviving was more important than dignity. But more than that, he thought about the land. Every narrow path between the fields. Every patch of unstable ground softened by water. Every place where bamboo grew thick enough to block sound. Every trap he had learned to build to protect crops from animals. He knew this land like the soldiers knew their rifles. Better, perhaps, because a rifle can fail, can jam, can run out of ammunition. But the land was always there, unchanging, infinitely patient, waiting to be used by someone who understood its rules. He knew the patterns of the rains. He knew that during monsoon season, certain paths transformed into rivers of mud that could suck a man down to his knees. He knew the trees that looked strong but had rotten roots, ready to give way under sudden weight. He knew where bamboo grew so dense that creating a maze was simply a matter of guiding someone inside. He knew every stone, every fallen log, every depression in the terrain where water accumulated, creating natural traps. This knowledge wasn't academic. It didn't come from maps or studies. It came from thousands of hours working under the scorching sun, walking barefoot through cold morning mud, watching how the land changed with the seasons. It came from a lifetime of belonging to this place, from generations of ancestors who had walked these same paths, worked these same fields, whispered their secrets to their children. The French had maps. He had living memory. The French had compasses. He had instinct. The French had strategy. He had survival. And that night, when he rose and retrieved his tool from the earth where it had been kicked, he was no longer thinking about survival. He was thinking about justice. Raw, primitive, relentless justice. The kind of justice that doesn't come from courts or laws, but from land soaked with the blood of his people, from memories of burned villages, from shattered families, from decades of humiliation under foreign boots. The tool in his hands didn't look different. It was still the same worn wood, the same blade dulled from so much use. But something had changed. It was no longer just a tool. It was a statement. It was an answer. It was the materialization of everything that couldn't be said with words. The French soldiers believed the night belonged to them. They were wrong. The night belonged to the land, and the land belonged to him. It always had. It always would. Long after the French were gone, long after the last traces of occupation had been erased, this land would remain. And it would remember. The land always remembers. The patrol relaxed after sunset. Boots were removed. Rifles were stacked, not far, still within arm's reach, but stacked nonetheless. Fires burned low. Laughter returned, softer now, mixed with exhaustion. Men ate, drank, and spoke of home, of Paris, of Marseille, of small towns in Brittany and Provence, of girlfriends and wives, of lives waiting on the other side of the ocean. They believed themselves safe. They had numbers, they had weapons, they had experience, they had training. They had fought in other colonial campaigns. Some had served in Africa, others in Syria. They knew how war worked. They knew how rebellions worked. They knew how to crush resistance. What they didn't have was patience. What they didn't have was knowledge of this specific land. What they didn't have was any understanding that they had pushed a man beyond the point where reason mattered. The first soldier died without understanding what was happening. He had wandered away from camp to urinate. Just a few meters. He could still hear his comrades' voices, could still see the glow of the fires. He was buttoning his pants, thinking about nothing in particular. Perhaps the letter he would write home tomorrow. Perhaps the meal he would eat when he got back to the outpost. Perhaps absolutely nothing. When there was sudden pressure, a sharp moment of confusion, and darkness. There was no gunshot, no warning, no scream. The tool had cut through the space between shadows with precision that came from years of repetitive work. The same motion he used to break compacted earth, to cut through thick roots, to penetrate resistant soil. But this time, the target wasn't earth, just the end, coming so fast that his brain had no time to process fear. His body fell into the mud without making a sound. The farmer had already learned where to step to make no noise. Already knew how to move in the dark without disturbing the environment. These were skills he used when hunting wild animals that threatened the crops. Skills he now used in a very different hunt. The jungle swallowed the sound. Bamboo closed over the spot. And when his blood ran into the water, it became just one more of the thousands of things mixing with the earth that night. When the tool struck, it was no longer clean, and it wouldn't stop striking until the work was finished. The farmer dragged the body to an area he knew well, a depression in the terrain where water accumulated, covered by low vegetation. The place would be impossible to find in the dark. Even during the day, someone would have to be looking specifically. The body simply disappeared, as if the earth had opened and swallowed it. He cleaned the tool in the water, watched the blood disperse, become invisible, then moved back into the shadows, waiting. The jungle didn't echo, but fear did. 10 minutes passed before anyone noticed the soldier hadn't returned. At first it was just a joke. Some laughed. He must have gotten lost in the dark trying to find his own ass. More laughter. They drank more wine, told more stories. But 15 minutes became 20. 20 became 30. And finally, an officer frowned, called the soldier's name. No answer. Called again, louder. Still nothing. That's when the first crack appeared in their confidence. At first, the disappearance was blamed on carelessness, a man wandering alone. A stupid mistake. Maybe he had stumbled. Maybe he had gotten lost in the dark. Maybe he was too drunk and had passed out somewhere. Another soldier was sent to look for him. A young man, recently arrived from France, eager to prove his worth. He grabbed his flashlight and his rifle. "I'll find him," he said confidently. Other soldiers nodded. "Good luck. Come back quick." He walked in the direction the first man had gone. His flashlight cut through the darkness, creating shadows that danced and writhed. He called his comrade's name. His voice sounded strange among the trees, muffled, distorted, swallowed by the density of vegetation. 5 minutes later, his flashlight stopped moving, and then went out. Back at camp, the soldiers looked at each other. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. But what? They had guns. They had numbers. They had training. This was just Vietnamese countryside, full of frightened peasants who could barely look a French soldier in the eye. What could go wrong? A third soldier was sent, then a fourth. This time they went together, rifles ready, eyes scanning the shadows. They were more careful, slower, aware that something wasn't right. They found the second soldier's flashlight fallen in the mud, still warm, but no sign of the soldier. No blood, no struggle, just absence. One of them turned to head back to camp. That's when the farmer struck. There was no war cry, no warning. Just sudden movement from the shadows, too fast to follow, impossible to predict. The tool found its target before fingers could pull triggers. The second soldier managed to scream. A short sound, cut off, full of surprise more than pain. Then silence. Back at camp, that scream changed everything. They did not return. And that's when the first tremor of true fear ran through the camp. The soldiers began to realize something was wrong. Very wrong. This wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't coincidence. 5 men don't simply disappear in 15 minutes just meters from a camp full of armed soldiers. Orders were shouted, but there was already hysteria in the voices. Names were called into the darkness, echoing unanswered among the trees. Flashlights cut through trees and tall grass, creating more shadows than revealing anything. Shots were fired at shadows that may or may not have been there. The thunderous sound of rifles breaking through the night, creating more panic than security. But the earth absorbed the noise and returned only silence. The commanding officer, a veteran captain with 15 years of colonial service, tried to impose order. "Defensive formation! Now!" His voice carried authority, but there was a note of uncertainty his men had never heard before. "Backs to each other! No one moves alone!" They obeyed, forming a tight circle around the dying fires. 48 men now, from 63, 15 missing in less than an hour. The numbers were impossible, implausible, but real. This was not a battle. There were no front lines, no orderly tactical formation, no clear enemy marching toward them. There were no uniforms to aim at, no fortified position to attack, no strategy that their training at the Paris barracks had covered. Their instructors had never taught them how to fight something they couldn't see, that made no sound, that attacked from everywhere and nowhere. It was a hunt, and they were not the hunters. For the first time in their lives, these men, veterans of campaigns in Algeria, men who had suppressed revolts in Madagascar, soldiers who had marched through Syria, understood what it meant to be prey, and the terror of that realization was paralyzing. The farmer watched from a safe distance, hidden in dense vegetation. He could see the circle of men illuminated by the fires, could hear their nervous voices, could sense the fear emanating from them like visible heat. And he waited, because he had something they would never have: infinite patience. He could wait hours, days. His entire life had been about waiting. Waiting for seeds to grow, waiting for rains to come, waiting for the harvest to ripen. Patience was etched into his bones. They, on the other hand, were soldiers trained for action, for movement, for doing something. Inaction ate at them faster than any enemy. Anyone who moved alone disappeared. Even with strict orders to stay together, fear had a way of isolating men. Someone turned too quickly. Someone took 3 steps in one direction while the rest moved in another. Someone panicked and ran, and the farmer was there, waiting for those moments of weakness. He never attacked blindly. He waited, watched, studied movement patterns, noticed which soldier was most nervous, which one held his rifle poorly, which one kept looking in the wrong direction. He struck only when there was no escape, only when he had absolute certainty, only when the angle was right, the moment was perfect, when the land conspired with him to make escape impossible. He used geography as a weapon. He made subtle sounds, a branch breaking here, leaves moving there, to lure soldiers to areas where the ground gave way underfoot, where exposed bamboo roots caused stumbling in the dark, where darkness was deeper because tree cover blocked even starlight, where sound distorted in ways that confused direction. Echoes that made it seem a sound came from the left when it actually came from the right, where his advantage was absolute and theirs disappeared completely. Every part of this land was known to him, unknown to them, and that difference was lethal. Panic spread among trained men like a disease. Discipline began to crack visibly. Rifles were fired too quickly, wasting precious ammunition on shadows. Commands contradicted each other. One officer shouted to hold position, another shouted to retreat to the village. A third ordered a charge to find the enemy. Officers shouted orders that were ignored by men desperately trying to understand what was happening. Men whose training had crumbled before something that defied all military logic. Fear replaced confidence. Terror replaced arrogance. Some soldiers dropped their weapons to move faster, a fatal mistake they would have mocked if they saw others commit. But the weight of rifles seemed impossible now, when every second counted, when every shadow could be death. Others clustered so tightly they could barely move, backs pressed together, eyes wide, imagining movement everywhere. They fired at trees that seemed to move, at shadows that seemed like human shapes, at their own reflections distorted by panic and darkness. They wasted ammunition on ghosts, while the real predator watched and waited. They had rifles, modern weapons, superior technology, the pride of French industry. He had time, infinite commodity for someone who was home. They had training, years of drills, simulations, conventional tactics. He had terrain, absolute knowledge of every inch of land his feet had touched for decades. They had numbers, still more than 40 men, still a formidable force in any conventional battle. He had patience, the ability to wait for the perfect moment, to never rush, to let their panic do half the work. And one by one, methodically, inevitably, the number shrank. 38, 32, 29. Each disappearance marked by a brief scream or absolute silence. Each loss corroding the survivor's sanity further. Bodies fell where they couldn't be seen, in depressions he knew, under vegetation he had identified years ago. Some were dragged into the water, where they would sink into soft mud and be sealed by the earth itself. Others disappeared into the trees, not literally, but pushed into areas so dense that finding them would require daylight and courage none of the survivors still possessed. The night hid everything, and each disappearance made the survivors more desperate, more terrified, more prone to committing the fatal errors the farmer was waiting for. In the early hours before dawn, when the sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly, the remaining soldiers were no longer laughing. That sound, that arrogant laughter that had echoed through the village just hours before, seemed to belong to a different life, different men, men who didn't yet know true terror. Now they were whispering, voices hoarse from shouting, eyes wide from staring at shadows. Some were praying quietly, fragmented quotes from prayers they hadn't recited since childhood. Some were begging in a language no one answered, pleading for mercy from an enemy they couldn't even see, much less reach. Some were crying silently, tears tracing clean paths through faces dirty with gunpowder and mud, realizing they would never see their homes again. That the letters they had written and not yet sent would remain in backpacks that would rot in this forgotten land. That the people they loved, mothers, wives, children, lovers, would never know what happened on this meaningless night in a nameless village in a country most French people couldn't even locate on a map. The farmer did not shout in triumph, did not celebrate, did not speak a single word. He just moved, methodical as the rising sun, relentless as the tide, like someone harvesting rice in organized rows or clearing fields of weeds or preparing land for the next season. It was work, terrible, bloody, necessary work, but work nonetheless. And he had spent his entire life doing work that broke him, that bent his back, that cracked his hands, that never truly ended. But this would end. Before dawn. He would make sure of that. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky red and gold, the village was silent. Not the silence of peace, the silence of the end. The kind of silence that carries weight, that presses against eardrums, that makes skin crawl. 63 French soldiers had entered the area the day before, laughing, confident, armed, representing the power of an empire that stretched across continents. None of them left. 63 men, 63 lives, 63 families waiting in France for letters that would never arrive. 63 names that would be whispered in chapels, engraved on memorials, wept for in dark rooms across an ocean. But the circumstances, those would remain shrouded in official mystery. No bodies were officially recovered. When search teams finally came, and they came eventually, because 63 men can't simply disappear without investigation, they found nothing. Abandoned camp, scattered equipment, signs of panic, but no bodies, not enough blood to tell the story, no evidence that made sense in official reports. The land had swallowed its secrets. No photographs were taken. The cameras some soldiers carried were broken or missing. No visual record of that night would exist. Reports were written carefully, each word weighed and measured by superior officers who understood that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. The patrol was listed as missing. Probable ambush by numerous insurgent forces. Uncertain circumstances. Hostile terrain. Investigation inconclusive. The words were technically true, but they hid the reality that no colonial commander would dare admit, that 63 armed and trained men had been methodically eliminated by a single farmer with a farming tool. Because admitting that would mean admitting that the entire edifice of colonial power was built on illusion. That superior technology didn't guarantee victory, that greater numbers didn't mean security, that military training could be useless against someone fighting for their own land. And above all, it would mean admitting that the primitives, the inferiors, the conquered, all those words that justified occupation, were capable of things that defied all the empire's assumptions. Colonial command moved on because that's what empires do. There were other patrols, other villages, other problems. 63 men were a significant loss, yes, but not a loss that would change the war. Not a loss that would matter in the grand scheme of maintaining an empire that stretched from Africa to Asia. The records were filed in some basement in Hanoi, then transferred to Saigon, eventually sent back to Paris where they would gather dust in archives no one would consult. Families were notified with vague explanations, killed in action, missing in combat, lost in hostile territory. Medals were awarded posthumously, pensions were paid, and the machine of colonial occupation continued advancing, grinding lives under its indifferent gears. But something changed, even if it was never officially acknowledged. French patrols no longer lingered in that region. When maps were updated, routes were drawn around that area. Soldiers moved faster when passing nearby. They avoided the area at night absolutely. Explicit orders were given. No camping, no night patrols. Move before nightfall or wait until dawn. They didn't laugh as easily, these soldiers. When they spoke about that area, if they spoke at all, it was in low voices, with nervous glances over their shoulders, with the kind of fear that comes from not understanding what's hunting you, with the visceral knowledge that there are things in the world that training can't prepare you to face. Veterans murmured warnings to newcomers. Don't go there, especially at night. Men disappear. And when asked why, they shook their heads. They didn't know, didn't want to know, just knew enough to be afraid. The village itself slowly disappeared from maps. First, the names were changed, small modifications that made it difficult to connect new reports with old ones. Then routes were redirected. Paths that used to pass through the village now went around it. Eventually, the area became a blank space in official colonial records. not because it wasn't important, but because remembering it meant admitting something that no empire can admit without beginning to crumble, that they weren't in control, that their weapons didn't make them invincible, that their technology couldn't conquer combined geography and will, that ordinary men, with ordinary tools, on land they knew intimately, were infinitely more dangerous than any army marching in formation, and that admission was poison to the mythology that sustained the entire colonial project. So it was forgotten. Officially, but not really forgotten. History prefers armies. It prefers generals whose names can be engraved on monuments. It prefers victories that can be measured in conquered territories and signed treaties. It prefers clear narratives with orderly beginnings, middles and ends, defined heroes and villains, technology triumphing over the primitive, progress advancing relentlessly in a straight line from darkness to light. It doesn't like stories where power collapses silently in the dark, where training becomes dead weight, where precision rifles become useless clubs when you can't see what's attacking you, where men who should be weak, by the very definition of a system that categorizes them as inferior, prove to be anything but that. Because these stories raise dangerous questions. If one farmer can do this, what could an entire village do? What could a region do? What could a nation do when it finally decides it has lived on its knees long enough? These questions haunted French colonial command in Indochina. Not explicitly, not in memos or strategic meetings, but at the edges of their confidence, in the fear they tried not to show, in the way they looked at local inhabitants and wondered, just for a moment, how many other farmers were out there, waiting, watching, knowing their land better than any foreigner ever could. And perhaps, just perhaps, these unspoken questions were part of the reason why, 2 decades later, the entire edifice of French colonial dominance in Indochina collapsed at Dien Bien Phu, because the Vietnamese had learned the lesson that nameless farmer taught, that knowledge of terrain, infinite patience, and willingness to sacrifice everything could defeat rifles, artillery, even airplanes. But that's another story. This story is about one man, because ordinary men are dangerous, especially when they know their land, especially when they decide not to kneel, especially when all the fear, all the anger, all the humiliation of years of occupation crystallizes in a single moment of absolute clarity, that living on your knees is no longer living, that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed, that there are things worse than death, and the worst of them is forgetting you are human. That's why this story was buried. That's why you were never supposed to hear about it. But it happened. And somewhere, in dusty archives in Paris, there are reports that don't make sense. There are investigations that ended without answers. There are questions that were never asked because the answers would be unacceptable. And somewhere in Vietnam there is a village that no longer exists. There is land that remembers. There are stories whispered by people who know the truth but will never speak it aloud, because some stories are too dangerous to be told. Some truths threaten carefully constructed narratives, and some men, when reduced to the essential, when stripped of everything except their will to survive with dignity, become forces that no empire can control. This is the story they don't want you to know, the story of a nameless man, with an insignificant tool, on land that was his, against an empire that thought itself invincible, and when dawn came, only one of them remained.